So, hello everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are sitting around the world, and welcome to the latest seminar organised by the Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. My name is Liz David-Barrett. I'm the Director of the Governance and Integrity part of the ACE programme, and delighted to be here today for the launch of an excellent new policy brief that we've just published this morning, called Inside the Congo Hold-Up, How a Captured Bank Enabled Grand Corruption. Just to say to everybody that we are recording this session. It will be available on YouTube at some point via our website. So we are going to have a presentation from one of the main authors of this new policy brief. That's David Szakonyi, who's an associate professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He works on corruption, illicit financial flows, autocracy, and non-market strategy, and has projects from all around the world in Russia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Germany, the UK, and the US. He's currently finishing a book, and I really always delighted to see that, not just writing a book, but finishing a book, which is entitled The Technocrats, Competent Loyalists and Authoritarian Rule. And that's looking at the growing trend of technocrats working for dictators, with a special focus on Putin-era Russia. So we're going to hear from David for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have input from our discussant today, Anrike Visser. Anrike is an independent policy advisor, investigator, and the founder of Global Ground Consulting. She has 13 years' experience investigating financial crime, money laundering, and corruption across Europe, Asia, and Africa. And she also advises European governments, EU institutions, international financial institutions, and private companies on AML and CFT policies. We're going to be putting links to both of their organisations in the chat, as well as a link to the policy brief, which came out this morning. So without further delay, I will hand over to David for his 20 minutes to describe and present the research to us. David, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that very generous introduction. As Liz mentioned, today we launched a policy brief generously funded by the GIA's program, and from there, the UK government, entitled Inside the Congo Hold-Up, How a Captured Bank Enabled Grand Corruption. This is our first product under a 3-year project looking at grand corruption, kleptocracy, and illicit financial flows out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in this capacity, I'm representing the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, which has worked on this report as well as the 3-year project with PLOF, the Project to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa, specifically John Nelasso, who I think is on this call. But the report was co-authored by John, Florian, Michael, and myself, all of whose names are on the slide in front of you. So the motivation behind this project is that there are all types of enablers that help move illicit wealth around the world, especially from kleptocratic regimes into the global north. We spent a lot of time thinking about different categories of enablers, accountants, corporate service providers, lawyers, even real estate professionals that have played varying roles in facilitating these transfers. We think, and we argue in this brief, that banks, especially privately owned banks, are one of these enablers that have kind of eluded some of the scrutiny that has recently been placed on these other types of enablers, and that we need to focus a lot more on how captured banks, especially in kleptocratic states, are being instrumentalized in order to move illicit wealth abroad. There's lots of scandals involving Western banks, think of Danske Bank or Deutsche Bank, helping to transfer money and approve transactions. But we think that a lot of the even more malicious activity originates in domestic banks located in kleptocratic states that have been captured or have really strong political connections with the ruling elite. And one of the reasons why we think this category of enablers has been somewhat understudied is that it's really difficult to get data on banking transactions. There's privacy concerns, there's a lot of regulations that kick in when you deal with money of this kind. And therefore, for better or worse, researchers, analysts, civil society activists have kind of focused their attention on the places where data was available, and banks, maybe partly because there are longstanding international rules and regulations governing their behavior have kind of said, oh, well, those rules are working. We don't have to worry about the banks as much because we have another system of law that is helping to drive attention and scrutiny of what's going on inside them. Let's focus on these other enablers. But we think that banks deserve much more investigation. And what we do in this project is kind of take advantage of a brand new source of data that gives us incredible visibility into the operations of one domestic bank in one very prominent kleptocratic state, the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that case really draws on this Congo Hold-Up, which is the name for an international collaboration of journalists and NGOs back in 2021 that received the largest leak of financial data from the African subcontinent to date. So there are over 3.5 million documents leaked from BGFI's DRC subsidiary. BGFI is headquartered in Gabon, but has had a subsidiary in the DRC for decades now. There was a whistleblower that came forth to PLOF and shared these documents, and PLOF shared it with this coalition of journalists and researchers and published over 100 stories, I think in 19 different languages, exposing the grand corruption and the money laundering originating from this bank, but ultimately from President Kabila's presidential administration, really focusing on how political actors abused this bank. It was owned by a relative of President Kabila and was really central to the country's political economy. It wasn't the largest bank, but it was so politically connected that it really a lot of money ran through it for the time period of which the leak covered. Now, I really encourage you to read these stories. They're in any language you can choose, and there are white papers from NGOs. They're really accessible journalistic pieces that grace the front pages of many outlets around the world. But what we're doing in this project is saying, look, there was so much research being done on this leak, but what can we learn from it in terms of how do we improve policy or strengthen institutions based on this incredible reporting exercise? Because when you do this type of in-depth reporting, sometimes isn't the opportunity to kind of zoom out and look across the entire landscape of exposés and say, what are some patterns and what are some different kind of lessons learned about how to prevent these type of captured banks from playing such a damaging role within the international financial system? So this brief, and kind of a little bit different from work that we're going to do the rest of the year, doesn't actually engage in any new investigative activity, right? We're not going to break any new information about how money laundering worked, but rather we're going to take a hard look at what other journalists and investigators have done and try to categorize and typologize and draw some recommendations about how to prevent this from happening again. So in that sense, the report is less about how money was stolen from the state and more about how money moved through the central node, BGFIBank DRC, over the period which the leak covered. So on the top of this very helpful graphic, we see in green the different state institutions from which money was embezzled. So the National Electoral Commission, the Central Bank, the National Assembly, state-owned enterprises, other types of regulatory agencies, all kind of contributed, for lack of a better word, embezzled money, and that was stolen and brought through BGFIBank. And there are a lot of internal processes that I'll talk about in the next slide, but basically that money was moved through the bank into mostly Kabila-linked companies around the world. It started in oftentimes domestic companies, but then they made transfers to trusts, shell companies, and even individuals located around the world, and used a variety of different disguising mechanisms to cover their tracks. So we're going to be focusing basically on the what's happening inside this black circle, the BGFIBank. So how did the bank facilitate the movement of the money from the green institutions down to the companies? And I think it really helped mask and disguise a lot of illicit money because of the way the bank was structured and because of the way these operations were undermined. And that's really the focus of this report, because we're interested in banks as enablers and as these key actors within this broader money laundering infrastructure. To do so, we read basically all the reporting that had been done by this collaboration and tried to think of different categories or really put them into a typology of 5 different types of operations from within the bank that help to move this illicit cash. So first, there's a lot of fictitious loans that were made. This is very common around the world where the bank will loan money to a client, but not demand collateral, not demand substantiation or kind of justification for the loan, and with little to no expectation that the money will ever be repaid. And that money then can disappears through that company's other transactions and never returns. We also identified a number of instances where there are fraudulent and fictitious cash transactions being carried out, so that cash was moved in and out of bank accounts linked to present activity. There's a little bit of static. Oh, cool. And so that the cash was really the propellant of a lot of these money laundering transactions. Another category is even more arcane, and these are compromised internal bank accounts. So every bank has different types of internal accounts to use for currency exchanges, to use as kind of liquidity insurance, and to move when you execute a transaction, even really banal ones within your own kind of private bank. It doesn't just move from one account to another. It usually passes through internal bank accounts that have varying functions that help kind of manage against risk or even kind of preserve different pots of money in different currencies. But we find that in the case of BGFIBank DRC, many of these bank accounts were used to kind of disguise the origins of funds and create kind of a cover story and kind of distract a lot of the auditors and people and oversight authorities from being able to trace the money because they would see an internal bank account and really that was a bit of a brick wall that they weren't able to penetrate and didn't ask more questions from. So a lot of the kind of the structure of the bank and the institutions that make every bank run efficiently and hedge against risk, in this case, were compromised in order to facilitate illicit financial flows. And then finally, one other big banking kind of mishap we see is just this misinvoicing of trade transactions. So there were companies that were claiming to be moving goods across borders and then receiving or sending cash in exchange for those products. But in actuality, there were no goods or services being moved. Everything was fraudulent, but that gave a cover story that there were invoices that were used to kind of justify these transactions that weren't in reality happening. And then finally, kind of this catch-all category is across all 4 different types of banking operations, we just see lax compliance and really captured oversight. That time and time again, there were bank employees and whistleblowers and even auditors that raised red flags, but they were overruled and undermined and even threatened by senior executives. And that there were also international auditing companies, some from the Big Four, that we can't assign negligence and don't want to in this sense, but intentional negligence, but that overlooked or didn't catch a lot of this really fraudulent activity that was happening in their midst, and therefore, in actuality, allowed it to kind of continue much longer than we might have expected. So this is the heart of the report, kind of walking through each of these 5 different categories, and we provide probably too many examples of how the bank and its employees engineer different ways of using each of these 5 different kind of mechanisms in order to move cash. I'll give you one example that kind of ties together a couple of these, and this is EGAL, which is a food importer that was created by the state in order to break a kind of monopoly or oligopoly by foreign firms importing food into the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it was really designed to bring down inflated prices. So by introducing another kind of state-backed competitor, it might alleviate some pressures within the food industry locally. But it's also a state-backed company that was run by highly connected individuals. And I think the investigations under the Congo Hold-Up collaboration really exposed how much this company was used to transfer money out of the state into the pockets of individuals, and all mostly stolen. So one example of this unsubstantiated or fictitious loans was $40 million that the bank received almost immediately the company received from the bank almost immediately after it was registered. So within a really short time period, it received this massive loan, but there was no accompanying documentation about what it would do with this money and how it would be paid back and what kind of activities it would engage in because of it. And that's one example of like how the bank basically flushed money out the door with any real kind of need on the part of the company applicant. There were also audits by both PwC and Deloitte that conveniently overlooked the lack of collateral. Like there are lending standards that were completely ignored in this case. And there wasn't even a physical loan file that later could be identified to substantiate this loan. And the auditors, we don't have a great story of why this was missed, but two different international auditors kind of overlooked the fact that this loan was being used to funnel money out of the state into this enterprise. We also see evidence of millions of dollars being transferred abroad. But then finally, there were a number of individuals within the bank who raised concerns. And when those red flags were triggered, the company, as well as more kind of compromised employees, falsified and backdated documents that were then accepted as valid in order to cover the tracks. So again, this is about three of the different categories in the typology all coming together, and overall you get tens of millions of dollars being stolen from the state and transferred to individuals, but all because of the complicity and the operations of the bank itself to make all this happen. So I'll just kind of give you a couple of the top level findings and then talk a little bit about recommendations and then go from there. But I mean, a really big one is that these politically connected banks are high risk vectors for illicit finance. And when we need to think about banks as an enabler in a very serious way, especially banks that have really strong connections to the ruling elite of these countries around the world. We're going to see time and time again that, newly ascended kleptocratic leaders oftentimes begin with the financial industry in terms of how they build their economic and political empires, because they know that banks have this kind of inroad, very, very advantageous inroad into the international financial system that will help them move money into assets that are a little bit more coveted or safer abroad. The second is that, banking almost by definition can be quite opaque, and that banks don't have, in many cases, the same type of reporting requirements, especially to the general public, and that these opaque processes can provide cover for blatant abuse. And there's a variety of different ways that we've talked about in the report that I just talked about in the typology, but really there's something about like these complicated financial structures. We've seen this in the West, right, with like derivatives and the way that housing markets have been distorted by lending activity, but it's also true in even less developed financial systems in the developing world, where the banking processes can be abused because there just isn't the same level of oversight, and the regulatory institutions aren't capable or aren't incentivized in order to pursue and expose a lot of these different types of activities. And that building off that, we just really see so many different examples of domestic and internal oversight being compromised or ignored. In this setting, the central bank was extremely ineffective and oftentimes complicit in facilitating illicit financial flows through the BGFIBank. And within the bank, there were lots of well-intentioned employees that were very alarmed by what was going on, but they just didn't have the autonomy and didn't have the ability to really push back and bring outside scrutiny into the bank. And that global financial institutions, especially correspondent banks, what I'll talk about in a couple slides, and international auditors, played a really passive role in facilitating corruption. And that we just have so many examples of them being made aware of concerns and being made aware of specific transactions that should have raised red flags and even been rejected, but acting instead of very cautiously, but kind of nonchalantly, is probably the best word to describe their behavior in terms of not taking sufficient action to pursue investigations and even cases, and even alert law enforcement authorities of the type of fraudulent transactions that were happening in their midst. They erred on the side of approval and then later kind of reconnaissance and accountability, rather than taking a more proactive stance and putting more pressure on the bank to justify what it's doing. And then finally, we really see that the patterns we observe at BGFI, this one bank in the DRC that was seventh by assets under management, this is not an isolated case in any respect. And we find cases in Azerbaijan and Turkey, and Afghanistan and Kyrgyzstan and Central America, where there are nominally privately owned banks, but that are more or less captured by ruling authorities, either through family ties or through longstanding kind of clan relationships. And those banks serve as these critical nodes into the international financial system. And BGFIBank, we are kind of fortunate in some respects to have the visibility through this leak into how this all worked. But in so many other cases, we just have no idea about how the banks are abusing their position in order to help the kleptocratic rulers move money abroad and even kind of steal money outside the purview of a lot of the regulators that are supposed to stop this type of activity. So just to not end on a sour note, we spent a lot of time in the report thinking through a set of recommendations for different types of stakeholders and have brainstormed and even run these recommendations by experts and other types of academics in the field to make sure that they're on point as much as possible so that some more than others would be actionable almost immediately. So I'll walk through a couple types of recommendations for groups of stakeholders. So we begin with kind of these intergovernmental organizations such as FATF, which are standard issuing bodies, but they don't necessarily have the same level of enforcement capacity as a conventional regulator would, as well as foreign governments who have more regulatory capacity and responsibility, but really only under the banks that are registered or moving money under their mist. So this is one group of kind of foreign actors that we think can pay more attention to this problem. We start kind of with this idea of PEPs, or politically exposed persons, and really wanting to expand the emphasis on how these PEPs can co-opt and capture banks and the oversight mechanisms that are designed to stop this type of behavior. So we think there should be a more prominent role for monitoring and at least creating distance between PEPs and financial institutions that right now is not sufficiently being kind of elaborated in these guidelines and standards. We also want to include, we recommend that auditor oversight would be included in anti-money laundering evaluations, right? We think auditors are a really important actor in all of this, but oftentimes they themselves aren't undergoing the same level of scrutiny and accountability as other different types of financial institutions. And I think our report shows that these auditors oftentimes when they drop the ball, there's not anyone looking over their shoulder and holding them accountable until years later when journalists get leaks such as this. So it'd be nice to incorporate them into the workflows. And we really see a lot more opportunity for facilitating relevant data sharing and collection across borders, that if there were more beneficial ownership transparency, especially different types of financial institution sharing data, that many of the problems that we identified in the report could have been caught much earlier and even prevented from expanding. And the last one really is about correspondent banking, which I'll spend like a whole slide on. And that there are a number of banks that served as correspondent banks for BGFI during this period, some more than others. But correspondent banks are the different players that allow money to move across borders through Swiss transfers and especially in dollars when banks don't have the domestic banks themselves don't have those relationships. So they're a facilitator of transactions, and conventionally they engage in compliance and AML due diligence of their clients rather than the clients being the domestic banks rather than the individual account holders. And we found in this sense, in this setting, that there were many instances where employees of these correspondent banks were made aware or were kind of concerned about the transactions that required their approval that were in dollars and that were going to flow through their banks, but didn't take sufficient action in order to kind of demand more documentation or really require their client banks to justify these transactions. So we think that correspondent banks have a lot of potential for improvement, and we would like these correspondent banks to engage more heavily with their client banks and help them to upgrade their due diligence and compliance procedures, so that if they are going to engage and enter into a relationship with domestic banks, that they're much more confident that there are the right kind of auditing procedures, the right type of transaction monitoring, and the right type of compliance safeguards within these domestic banks. And so that we want to put a little bit more burden on the correspondent banks to ensure that whatever transactions are flowing through them are of higher quality and less suspicious, and when things do happen, that they have the right recourse to report on them. And then finally, we're not naive. We know that there's a lot of other political obstacles in the Democratic Republic of Congo to developing a really honest and efficient financial system locally. But we see that, for countries to really develop and grow economically and attract foreign investment, they need to upgrade both their regulatory responsibilities and capacities among like financial intelligence units as well as central banks, as well as requiring their domestic banks to play by international rules and to enforce these standards. So we recommend a number of different things that, that differ in their level of feasibility in the short term, but we really want to focus the attention on this idea of distance between politically exposed persons, and especially those connected to the government, the high levels of the government and banks, and that countries would be well advised to enforce distance and pass standards that deny politically connected actors the ability to own or operate or really direct the affairs of financial institutions, because we see that nexus is really critical to this larger money laundering scheme. So we put in a lot of different recommendations that we think would help in this setting, and they're really applicable to a lot of states worldwide that are dealing with kind of weak institutions, but want to make that transition, want to make that jump. And we think that there's a lot of room for improvement, especially with regard to PEPs. So I've spoken a lot. I don't want to dominate the hour that we have. Thank you so much for joining our session. The report is live now, both on GIAS's website and circulating on social media. So I encourage you to have a look, and look forward to your questions and comments throughout the rest of the session.
Thanks very much, David. That it's such a fascinating story. And I think, as you said at the beginning, a really great example of taking this huge body of data that was initially leaked and then written about by journalists, and then distilling from that what are the takeaways for policymakers around how this happens and what we should be doing about it. So great research, great policy brief. We're now going to hear some reflections from our discussant, Anrike Visser. For anybody who missed it earlier, Anrike is an experienced investigator of financial crime, and she's going to talk for about 10 minutes. After Anrike, we will open up to questions from the floor. So if you have questions, start thinking about them. You can add them in the chat if you'd like to, and we'll come to you once we've heard from Anrike. But Anrike, now over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz, and congrats, David, on a very interesting paper, honestly. I try to be critical, but I agree with most of the recommendations. So I decided to put it in a wider context for the relevance, and also on the recommendations. I have a few I'd like to add from a regulator perspective where I used to work, but also from a banking perspective where I advise a lot nowadays. I think, first of all, it's important to mention that cases that are really detailed in analysis and explore how illicit enrichment occurs are very scarce. So in that sense, I think this is different than some of the other papers that already exist out there, where it's more high-level recommendations. This is one of the few cases where we really look at step by step how the enrichment happened and what the role was of local banks, of regional banks, global banks, and then also the auditor institutions. So I think in that sense, it's essential reading for everybody working on financial crime and corruption, and not just in the DRC and Africa, as you mentioned, David, but all around the world, I would say. I also really like that you come with very concrete recommendations for the different audiences, both for the law enforcement agencies, for international standard setting bodies that definitely have a role to play here, and also the local and global banks that we already mentioned. Just to add to that, these are some of the other regions indeed that you also mentioned. I think it's very important to highlight that this wouldn't have been able to happen without the involvement and the facilitation of global financial banks. I think it's very easy to point the finger at countries where there might be anti-money laundering deficiencies, but there definitely is a role for all of us. We live in a globalized world. These transactions should have been stopped at every step of the way, and they were not. And in that sense, there's a very important lesson for all of us. Also because while the paper focuses on state capture, so politically exposed persons and their family members, in this case, a sister and adopted brother of the former president, there are other known cases of organized crime groups and even major businessmen that also attempt or succeeded in capturing financial institutions. So it's a growing problem, I would say, around the world. And one thing that I wanted to highlight in my presentation is that while there indeed are gaps in terms of policies and regulatory framework, for me, what stood out most was the lack of implementation of existing policies. We've known about anti-money laundering issues in general for a long time, and specifically related to private banking also for decades. And there are several policies that haven't been implemented along the way. So I think right now the momentum is there to really focus on implementation of enforcement and effectiveness. It's a very well-known saying in the sector that the best way to launder money on a large scale is to own a bank. So, or any other form of financial institution for that matter. So already since 1970, bank laundering was one of the main reasons for the Bank Secrecy Act, because it's just very easy to make suspicious transactions look like regular transactions if you own a bank. And that's, I think, also something that we saw in this case. But even though we know about the problem, how easy is it nowadays to buy a bank? When I worked at the regulator, we would regularly approve new board members of financial institutions, and there would be a suitability and a trustworthiness check that everybody had to comply with. And that's something that that doesn't seem to have happened in this case. I think the adopted brother was a deputy director. I have questions about his suitability for that specific role. And also the sister, she was a minority owner and owned 40% of the bank. But in that instance, she did seem to have some influence on the policy of the bank. So in my personal opinion, she should have been tested also. So, and I think an additional check that we should do is making sure that they are not related to family members or related to political parties, of course. The role of global financial institutions, as a starting point, there should always be enhanced due diligence when it applies to transactions from high-risk jurisdictions. Currently, the DRC is grey-listed by the Financial Action Task Force and the European Union. Not that there's no criticism about the FATF methodologies, there definitely is. But I think there should be right now enhanced monitoring on transactions coming from the country. And you also mentioned before, David, that doesn't mean that all transactions should be blocked. We need to facilitate regular and valid transactions from the countries. But to do that, we need to make sure that illicit transactions don't fall through the cracks. There are policies that exist to do this kind of things, but it apparently didn't happen in this case. One of the main reasons, in my opinion, is that we are talking about a private bank. Private banking cater to high net worth individuals. They have been a known money laundering risk for quite some time. And often there is a conflict of interest between the employee at the bank who has a profit motive and a very close relationship with the client, but at the same time is supposed to check all the transactions. And especially when that client then also is your boss, that power dynamic is completely skewed, and we see that existing policies are just not followed through. And this indeed is an example from 1997, where the US published a letter on private banking risk. And these are some of the risks that we already know for a long time. Interestingly, both the banking sector and the international standard setting sector has developed policies. I wanted to highlight here briefly the Wolfsberg Group, which is a network of global banks. The 12 largest banks in the world come together to devise policies among themselves. Citigroup, one of the banks that is mentioned in the paper as a facilitator, is a member of the group. And they've had a private banking policy since 2012, which includes enhanced due diligence for politically exposed persons and their family members, and maintaining a proper record, really assessing the source of wealth and the source of funds of those politically exposed persons. And again, I wanted to highlight the role of financial centers. Just the assessment of the Luxembourg regulator said that even though Luxembourg might not be an origin country, there are known cases of layering and integration of money laundering using financial institutions. So it's something that we all around the world should keep an eye out for. To be fair to the banking sector, though, because so far I'm pretty critical, the compliance departments are spending a lot of money and time trying to implement some compliance due diligence. Compliance burnout and fatigue is a very well-known problem. If I remember correctly, 59% of the sector is experiencing in a year burnout symptoms. And I think this just does not look well for us. If on the one hand, we spend a lot of money, the banking sector spends more than 200 billion every year on compliance. The compliance officers themselves report high levels of burnout. At the same time, there still is every year between 1.6 and 2 trillion of estimated illicit financial flows. And only 1% of the suspicious activity reports that are made are actually investigated. So there just is a massive gap between all the effort and policies on the one side, and then the output and the implementation on the other side. So I think my main recommendation would focus on going from checkbox compliance to enforcement and implementation. I spoke to a compliance officer, a former compliance officer at a Singaporean bank a few weeks ago, and they mentioned how they check the correspondent banking relationships. They actually have literally a checkbox, which they send to potential local bank partners, where they just check if they have an anti-money laundering policy, if they conduct enhanced due diligence for politically exposed persons. And I think that type of assessment, if you even want to call it that, doesn't work anymore. At least they should see the policies for themselves, test the quality of them. I would also really recommend that they spot check implementation of the policies in a limited number of high-risk cases, just to make sure that it's really being implemented. And they should always identify who the owners are and if there's any potential or appearance of conflicts of interest between bank ownership and politicians, organized crime groups, and major crony oligarchs or businessmen in the country. Then also closing some of the data gaps. Data sharing, even between banks, is really difficult. There is an instance in the Netherlands where they tried to improve this. They recently found out that they can improve fraud cases or block fraud cases if they check if people are at the same time when they are making a bank transfer that looks suspicious, like an elderly person trying to make a crypto donation all of a sudden. They now have a data sharing initiative with a telecommunications provider, because in 75% of the cases, they are on the phone at the same time when they are trying to make the transfer. So public-private partnerships, data sharing among banks, even within the same group in the same country, could really improve this. And then finally, just going from enforcement or going from policies to enforcement, we really need to increase the consequences when we do find cases. The penalties need to be more significant. We need to have more personal criminal liability to really make sure these cases are deterred more effectively. So I just wanted to leave it at this. And again, congrats, David. I really love the paper.
Thank you very much, Anrike. That was a really great view from a technical expert in the field too, in terms of how things really work and what can be done. So it's time now to move to the audience Q&A session. So please, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand as you wish. You can ask questions about the policy brief, about the process of turning leaks and journalism into data and analysis, you can ask questions about technical issues around how we do better compliance. So do think about what questions you'd like to ask. In the meantime, while we're just waiting, we have one question. I will throw in a couple of questions from the chair to abuse my position, but then we'll also go to Justa and take her question. So I was going to ask, I think, one of my reflections from listening to you both is about the difference or the balance between controls and systems versus culture. And I think this is something that comes out a lot in the policy brief, that David documents how there are lots of people who blow the whistle on this. There are lots of people internally in the bank who spot the red flags, blow the whistle, but then they get ignored, it gets covered up. There's a lot of a sense that the multinationals who are involved, the auditors, are not really blowing the whistle, on the other hand, and not really raising things up for attention when they should be. So I guess my question for you both would be around, how do you think about this balance between controls versus organizational culture in terms of where the focus should be, and how can we fix the kind of the cultural problem, particularly in a situation where you've got a lot of political interference, a lot of a quite authoritarian context where we know that people often almost anticipate what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to behave, and then they're obedient in response to that, without necessarily having to have someone pick up the phone and say, make sure you allow this transaction to go ahead, or make sure you cover up that whistleblower report. So that's a question from me. I'm going to go to Justa now. Justa, would you like to ask your question? And just maybe quickly introduce yourself, one sentence, and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Justa Wawira Mwangi, and I'm a GIS scholar and fellow. I'm studying a lot of work. I'm doing a lot of research on corruption. My question, I was very interested, and it's a pity I missed the first 10 minutes of your presentation. I'm very curious about this policy brief, and Professor Elizabeth has already touched on some of the parts that I'd wanted to ask about, basically about whistleblowing. And I'm curious whether there are layered reporting lines or whispering lines that whistleblowers can use to reach the top echelons of reporting on these issues, like at the global level. Is there a structured way where whistleblowers can actually escalate these issues, or this information can reach the top levels? Because you do have a lot of players all over, and I'm just wondering whether that is structured, or whether there are maybe even mechanisms to protect them, witness protection systems, or how does, because I believe they are very essential in countering this kind of problems, that in illicit money flows and laundering. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Okay, so we'll go back to David now, and then also come to you, Anrike, if you'd like to add anything. But David first.
Sure. Thanks for the great questions. I am skeptical that organization culture changes without dramatic shocks, especially those produced by whistleblowing. I think we've seen this in the West. Take Switzerland, for example. Like there wasn't real institutional change until you had high-profile whistleblowers, oftentimes who gained monetarily or avoided prison, which is also a positive benefit, and shared information with US regulators that forced the Swiss to change the way that banking was done in a very dramatic way in our lifetimes. So I am encouraged by the existence of organizations like PLOF, not to give them too big of a plug to my partner, but I think oftentimes third party or international whistleblowing organizations or journalistic collaborations such as OCCRP or ICIJ or a number of journalists who have created safe spaces to deposit information as well as who cooperate with international NGOs to provide protections to whistleblowers and especially the legal assistance down the line. I let Ploff talk, and they've got a lot of reporting about how they engineered or and protected the source, but there's a lot of instances where banks go after whistleblowers, and that it's not just about protecting the witness in the short term, but it's about the long run lawyering up in order to prevent these cases from escalating further. So I honestly think that most of these banks will not change their behavior until they face financial costs, and the best way to face financial costs if there's a lax central bank or lax domestic regulatory authority is to escalate up to the international level and involve different types of international journalists and civil society activists. I think PLOF is the best positioned to receive and protect those whistleblowers. And I think also that's true in the global north as well. I mean, some of the things we've learned from the Panama Papers and all the other leaks is that whistleblowers can have dramatic effects on the way that institutions are run. But we need to do a better job of incentivizing and protecting that type of source.
And if I just may add to that, I definitely think that organizational culture is essential. I'm actually an anthropologist by study, so maybe I'm biased in that sense. But I think without international culture and really trying to change that, you can write everything down on paper, but without leadership from the top, without international pressure, without civil society and media focus and the general public really saying this is not good, we don't accept this, it's impossible to change. And I think there's also a role for international collaboration on this, because I know how difficult it is for local civil society sometimes to publish very sensitive stories. So there's very interesting examples like PLAV, like OCCRP, Transparency International, where sometimes it helps to have international media take the brunt or publish the first article about it and support civil society in that sense.
Great. Thank you both very much. Just on the point about incentivizing whistleblowers, there's a very good paper by Eliza Lockhart that was published by our ACE partner, the SOC-ACE program recently. So we can probably put a link to that in the chat, but looks at the case for incentivizing whistleblowers financially. Fantastic. We're going to take 2 more questions in the next round, and then we'll come back for more. So first of all, there's one in the chat from Luis Ventura. He says, having navigated the realities of being a PEP for over 2 decades, I'm familiar with the friction these safeguards create. But what this report highlights painfully well is that truly entrenched corrupt actors often bypass those same controls with ease. While the proposed reforms are comprehensive and well crafted, I'm not overly optimistic about their impact in highly captured states, where even robust measures can struggle to gain traction. So yeah, the sort of classic problem we have, if you've got a really difficult situation like this, will these kinds of controls work? But before I come back to our speakers, I'd like to go to Kay Rafitason. Kay, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Liz, thank you so much, and hi, and hey everyone. Congrats for the great report. So I am from Transparency International, and the Congo Hold-Up investigation, I think, revealed how various trade misinvoicing to compromised internal bank accounts were used to mask illicit financial flows. So as an anti-corruption practitioner from Africa, I am wondering how our and their international partners move beyond basic reporting to implement real-time Also integrated dynamic monitoring of transactions and clients, and also strengthen beneficial ownership systems that are truly resilient to political capture and effectively empower citizens, prevent abuse, and restore trust in the financial system. Because it seems like a really big program, and I'm a bit struggling, and trying to understand how to put that from paper to practice, even if you already gave some little insights on that, Anrike, and thanks for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kay. Okay, so back to David first.
Sure. Yeah, I share your skepticism about how much a report like this can do domestically in a place like the DRC. I think the way that we've tailored the recommendations is the hope that the global north needs to get its own house in order, and that would have prevented a lot of the problems that we identified. So this begins with, say, the correspondent banks. We are not advocates of de-risking or cutting off countries from the international financial system, but we want to see that correspondent banks play a more robust and proactive role in building the capacity of their clients in order to do this type of monitoring and transactions on condition of gaining entry to the SWIFT system in the international banking. So this is not going to be easy. We've been told that correspondent banks don't make a lot of money on these relationships, and they're more likely just to cut ties if things go wrong rather than invest in the relationships. But we think that there's opportunities for domestic regulators and standard setting bodies to put more emphasis on building capacity through the correspondent banks and through these other types of gatekeepers. And that goes to the second comment of like, right, if we can't expect beneficial ownership transparency to really stick in a lot of these countries, well, we should start in the global north and make sure that if you do invest money in any of these countries, you will be exposed and pay consequences and even face expropriation. And hopefully there'll be spillovers or trickle-down effects to the rest of the world when they realize that a lot of the safe havens aren't that safe anymore. So yeah, I want to emphasize that a lot of the recommendations are not actually geared to the DRC where we know that there's all these obstacles, but rather trying to find different ways that the West can force enablers to clean up their act, because we think that would have not prevented the situation from happening, but at least limited the amount of damage that it actually did.
Thank you very much. Anrike, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the second question, if you don't mind, about trade-based money laundering. It's one of the most sticky issues around the globe, I would say. On-the-ground banking is a massive problem, trade-based money laundering, and I think crypto really is increasing in importance. But I think it's important to really look at the different sectors because it's just a method, right? So sometimes they use electronics or use cars or natural resources, gold and art. And I think it's such a big topic that we really need more research per country, per region, per sector to identify the methods that are being used. And there are some interesting examples with used cars, like what is a normal price or an average price for this car? And then there will be red flag indicators for custom officers, for example, to flag if a price really deviates. And sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. So there are initiatives happening, but we're still starting. And the worrying thing is that we're seeing a shift from financial institutions in regulated countries to trade-based money laundering. So we definitely need more focus on that. Good comment, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So another and possibly final round of questions. So we did have two people with their hands up, but at the moment we've just got one. So James Anderson, Jim, is that you? It is. Hello.
Hi, yes, I am me. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, which was super interesting. Also the commentary, very interesting and practical. I just have a question, I guess, which kind of gets to this issue of culture as well. But what do we know? And sorry if I missed it, but what do we know about the leak itself? So the source of the leak, the motivations for the leak. Is anything known about that? And, I was just wondering, what if the leak hadn't been leaked? Like how long could this have gone on? Anyway, just wondering about the source of the leak, but looking forward to reading the paper. And thanks for the invitation.
Great question. And I've also tracked down, so the other questioner has put their question in the chat. So Karok says, given the significant power of international auditing firms like PwC and Ernst & Young in granting credibility to financial transactions and institutions, both in global north and south, and their role as a crucial link between correspondent banks and local financial systems, why is there so little accountability placed on them? Are we beginning to recognize the importance of their position as enablers of corruption? Okay, so David first, then Anrike.
Sure. I personally know absolutely nothing about the whistleblower. There was a public whistleblower in 2014 who came forward and shared his identity and a lot of information about the bank and forced it to change its practices. The second whistleblower has been assured complete anonymity and has pending court cases against him or her, but I know nothing about the motivations and incentives and refer you to Ploff, who have engaged with him or her personally. But I think it was, as far as we know, an employee that was concerned about things that were happening under the bank and then shared these documents with Ploff. But it in that sense, it shares some commonalities with the Panama Papers leaker, which is the identity is just not central, and the motivations, to my knowledge, have never been shared. That said, there are no financial incentives. If anything, this was a very personally destructive decision, as far as I can tell, and there's just not a system in place to reward whistleblowers of this kind coming from this setting in the same way that you would in the U.S. or the global north. But I'm happy to connect you to people at Ploff if you're interested in learning more, and I have no idea what they'd be able to share. Yeah, and the second question, I'll speak briefly and then head over to Enrique. But I haven't seen much on the auditors. I think holding auditors accountable means first identifying the problems in the companies and banks that they're auditing to show where they missed the mark. And we just don't have a lot of data on the specific financial transactions that they observed and approved and didn't draw attention to. And I think that's a whole nother case. And I see now that, yeah, it'd be good to resurrect those findings, as Zoe puts in the chat, right? There's just, it comes and goes, and auditors really only face accountability with publicly traded firms that are shown to kind of stockholders and shareholders have lost because auditors dropped the ball. Whereas a lot of these private firms and private banks, I just don't think there's consequences down the line for auditors outside of the reputational risk of these exposés coming to light.
Thank you. Anrike.
Yeah, on the auditor side, I think it's very similar to what we also saw with notaries and legal professions, that on the one hand, you're supposed to be an independent professional, but at the same time, there is an opaqueness in that function because they start to offer other kinds of services, more business and corporate services. And the business side often makes more money, or you get involved in tax planning and other activities start to emerge. So really, this could undermine or could create conflicts of interest if on the one hand, you're offering tax planning services, for example, but you're also auditing the same company. So it would be great actually if they could also become an obliged entity under AML regulations. I think they're currently not. But notaries and legal professions and art dealers and dealers in precious metals are now in the EU at least. And the Financial Action Task Force also pushes for that globally. I haven't looked enough into auditors, but I think that would be the next step, because I agree this is outrageous.
Thank you both. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, we still know, yes, a consistent problem that it's proving very difficult to fix, despite numerous scandals. Thank you both very much. I need to draw the seminar to a close now, but just to say that there will not be an ACE seminar next month. The seminar series takes a break and we'll be back in September. If you want to be sure not to miss it, then do sign up for our GI ACE newsletter. Susanna will be putting a link in the chat to tell you how to do that, or follow us on socials. Do remember to go and read the policy brief. Again, it's available on our website. The link is in the chat as well. So go, it's all extremely nicely presented and a great read. So highly recommend that. And nothing left to do but to thank very much David and Anrike for a really great session, and all of the participants who came along and asked such great questions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.